The email hit my phone just as Austin's heart monitor started beeping faster. 89 beats per minute. Too fast. The ICU nurse looked up from checking his IV line, her expression calm but focused. My 8-year-old son's face was still swollen from the anaphylactic shock, his breathing shallow but steady thanks to the ventilator they'd hooked up an hour ago. I stared at those 5 words on my screen while holding Austin's small hand in mine. His fingers felt cold despite the heated blankets they'd wrapped around him. 7 years of dedication. 7 years of being the first one in the office, last one out. 7 years of missed Little League games and Daddy has to work late conversations with my boy. All ended with an email while my son fought for his life in a hospital bed. I didn't break down. Couldn't afford that luxury. Not when Austin needed me steady, not shattered. So I slipped the phone back into my pocket and squeezed his hand a little tighter. The heart monitor settled back to a normal rhythm. 72 beats per minute. Better. I'm Chuck Garrison, 49 years old, and until that email arrived, I was the senior program director at Apex Infrastructure Solutions. I'd joined the company 7 years ago, straight out of my discharge from the Army Corps of Engineers, where I'd spent 10 years building bridges, roads, and water systems from Afghanistan to Louisiana flood zones. The transition from military to civilian life hadn't been easy. In the Army, when someone gave their word, it meant something. When we said a project would be completed by a certain date, soldiers and civilians were counting on that promise. Lives depended on it. I thought corporate America worked the same way. I was wrong. My ex-wife Sarah had died from cancer 4 years ago, leaving me to raise Austin alone. She'd been the organized one, the one who remembered his medication schedules and kept track of all his allergies. The kid's allergic to everything: peanuts, tree nuts, shellfish, bee stings. You name it, Austin's probably got a reaction to it. After Sarah passed, I became obsessive about his medical care. Every teacher, coach, and babysitter had detailed emergency instructions and backup EpiPens. I'd mapped every hospital between our house, his school, and my office. I kept his allergy list laminated in my wallet, my car, and my desk drawer. What I hadn't planned for was betrayal from the company I'd helped build. 6 hours earlier, I'd been putting the finishing touches on a federal compliance presentation I'd spent 3 months preparing. Austin's school called just as I was reviewing the final slides. Mrs. Patterson, his teacher, was trying to stay calm, but I could hear the panic in her voice. "Mr. Garrison, Austin accidentally ate something with nuts in the cafeteria. We've administered his EpiPen and called 911, but you need to get here now." My hands were already reaching for my keys when my boss, Patty Holbrook, appeared in my doorway. Patty was 44, sharp as a razor, and had climbed the corporate ladder in what was still mostly a man's world. She'd earned her position through pure determination and a willingness to do whatever it took to close deals. "You can't leave," she said. "Not today." "My son is having an allergic reaction," I replied, already moving past her. She stepped directly into my path. "This presentation cannot be rescheduled. You know how hard we worked to get these federal auditors in one room?" I looked at her like she'd lost her mind. "My son could die. Someone else can handle a school situation. This is a $15 million federal contract. Some choices aren't choices at all. I'll call from the ambulance. Someone else can present the slides," I told her. Her expression shifted then. Something cold and calculating replaced the urgency. The look of someone making a business decision. "Fine. Go." I should have recognized it for what it was. Not acceptance, but a judgment. The decision that I was expendable. What Patty never understood was that while she charmed government officials with practiced smiles and polished presentations, I was the architect behind our success. My engineering background had transformed failing infrastructure projects into funded ventures. My military precision had produced the results that impressed federal oversight committees. My late nights had built the foundation she stood on to shine. But more than that, my systematic approach had built something into every project proposal that she didn't even know existed. The night before my termination, I'd noticed something troubling in our presentation materials. The progress reports showed impossible timelines. Communities supposedly transformed by projects that were still in planning phases. Completion metrics for infrastructure that hadn't even broken ground. I'd made notes to raise questions during the meeting, assuming there had been a scheduling error or miscommunication between departments. It wasn't an error. Now, as the paramedics had wheeled Austin into the emergency bay 6 hours ago, and doctors rushed to stabilize his breathing, I'd pushed everything else from my mind. The betrayal would have to wait. My son couldn't. I spent that first night in an uncomfortable hospital chair, watching Austin's vitals slowly improve as the medications reduced the swelling in his airways. The epinephrine had done its job, but they wanted to monitor him for delayed reactions. Every hour, a nurse would check his blood pressure, heart rate, and oxygen levels. By morning, Austin's color had returned to normal and his breathing was steady. That's when I'd received the follow-up email requesting immediate return of company property. No severance package, no explanation beyond termination for abandoning critical responsibilities during a scheduled client presentation. The second day, while Austin colored in his hospital bed, he'd insisted on bringing his art supplies from home. My mind cleared enough to understand what had really happened. Those progress reports weren't optimistic projections or aspirational goals. They were complete fabrications, sold as accomplished facts to federal auditors who thought they were overseeing legitimate infrastructure development that was actually helping American communities. Someone had been systematically lying to the federal government, and now they'd made me disappear before I could ask the hard questions. On the third day, as doctors prepared Austin's discharge papers, my phone started buzzing with calls from unknown numbers. I'd been ignoring them, figuring they were collection agencies or work-related calls I didn't want to deal with. But this one kept calling back. I finally answered. "Are you the creator of the compliance tracking system for Apex infrastructure?" asked an unfamiliar voice. "Yes," I replied carefully, stepping into the hospital hallway so Austin couldn't hear. "I represent the Federal Infrastructure Oversight Committee. There's something concerning we need to discuss about the sites we inspected yesterday." My grip tightened on the phone. "You inspected the sites?" "Yes, following the verification protocols outlined in your technical appendices. What Patty never realized was that I'd embedded something unique into every project proposal I'd ever written. A verification pathway that came straight from my military training. In the Army Corps, we didn't just build things and walk away. We built accountability into every system. Each claimed milestone in my reports included specific GPS coordinates, site supervisor contact information, and detailed inspection protocols. I'd always included this as standard operating procedure, the way we'd done things in Afghanistan when lives depended on accurate progress reports. I figured corporate clients would appreciate the transparency. Patty never read the technical sections anyway. She just cared about the executive summary and the pretty charts for presentations. The day of my scheduled presentation, while I was racing to the hospital with Austin, multiple federal auditors had decided to actually follow those protocols. They'd wanted to see firsthand the infrastructure improvements their oversight had approved. What they found instead were empty lots where water treatment facilities were supposed to be completed, incomplete bridge foundations that were listed as 80% finished, road improvements that existed only on paper. When they contacted the local supervisors listed in my reports, actual engineers I'd worked with during my preliminary site surveys, these people confirmed that very little work had actually been completed beyond initial planning phases. "Mr. Garrison," the voice on the phone continued, "we need to meet, today if possible." I glanced back at Austin, who was carefully coloring a picture of a fire truck. "My son is being discharged from the hospital this afternoon. We understand. This is about irregularities in project reporting that could involve federal fraud charges." That got my attention fast. I never planned this revelation. I didn't orchestrate some elaborate takedown scheme. My military training simply included thoroughness that my corporate boss couldn't comprehend. My firing had merely accelerated the auditors discovering the truth for themselves. After bringing Austin home from the hospital, I tucked him into bed with his favorite stuffed bear, the one Sarah had given him before her last surgery. "Will you stay home tomorrow?" he asked sleepily. "Just for the morning," I told him, smoothing his hair back. It was still a little thinner where they'd attached the heart monitor sensors. "Mrs. Rodriguez will come stay with you after lunch. Daddy has an important meeting." "About your work?" I hesitated. "About making things right. Like when I broke Jenny's crayon and had to tell Mrs. Patterson?" "Exactly like that, buddy." Once Austin fell asleep, I spent hours preparing, not with slides or charts, my tools for 7 years, but with truth. I gathered dates, notes, and meeting records where I'd raised concerns about timeline accuracy and project status. I found my original survey data showing actual site conditions versus what had been reported to federal oversight. The differences were staggering. Projects listed as 90% complete were barely 20% finished. Communities that were supposed to have new water systems were still dealing with contaminated wells. Roads that existed on federal progress reports were still dirt paths. Someone had been systematically falsifying federal contract reports for years. The next morning, after my neighbor Mrs. Rodriguez arrived to watch Austin, I dressed in my best shirt and tie, the ones I'd worn to Sarah's funeral. No company badge hung around my neck as I entered the coffee shop where we'd agreed to meet. Just me, my integrity, and steady determination. 3 people waited at a corner table, 2 men and a woman, all with the measured confidence of people who made decisions about millions in federal funding. They wore dark suits and carried federal ID badges that looked like they meant business. Chuck Garrison, the older man, stood and extended his hand. "I'm George Torres from the Federal Infrastructure Oversight Committee. This is Ben Fletcher from Regional Development Authority and Claire Adams from Project Compliance." Each nodded as I shook their hands. These weren't just auditors, these were the people who could shut down federal contracts and launch criminal investigations. "Thank you for meeting with us," George said once I'd sat down, "especially given your personal circumstances. How's your son doing?" "Austin's doing better," I said. "Thank you for asking." Ben leaned forward, opening a thick folder. "We'll be direct. Yesterday, following the verification guidance in your compliance reports, our teams inspected 4 project sites where Apex Infrastructure claimed significant progress. And, I asked, already knowing the answer but needing to hear it, we found nothing, George said flatly. No completed water treatment facility in Riverside County, no new bridge foundations in Oakmont Valley, no improved road infrastructure in Pine Valley. The Clearwater Community Center project was just an empty lot with survey stakes. Claire added, "We spoke with the exact engineering contacts listed in your technical appendices. They confirmed minimal work had been implemented. Some projects hadn't advanced beyond initial surveying and environmental impact studies. The room felt like it was getting smaller. These weren't minor discrepancies or optimistic projections. This was systematic fraud on a federal level." I took a deep breath, thinking about Austin asleep at home, trusting that his dad would handle whatever needed handling. I was terminated 3 days ago while my son was in the ICU. I had noticed discrepancies in our final reporting, but hadn't yet confirmed what they meant. "Were you aware the progress data was being falsified?" Ben asked, his tone carefully neutral but intense. "No," I said firmly. "I designed an honest evaluation system based on military accountability standards. Between my technical reports and the final submissions to your committees, someone was drastically altering my findings." "Who had access to modify your reports?" Claire asked, taking notes. "Several people, but ultimately everything went through our CEO for final approval," I admitted. "What I do know is that Apex has secured nearly $15 million in federal contracts based partly on these fabricated progress reports." The 3 auditors exchanged glances that told me this was bigger than I'd realized. "We represent oversight authority for about 60% of that funding," Claire said quietly, "and we've already contacted the other agencies involved." My stomach dropped. "What happens now?" "That depends partly on you," George said, sliding a document across the table. "We need someone with integrity to help us understand how this system was compromised." As they explained their proposal, I realized this moment wasn't just about exposing fraud. It was about protecting taxpayer money that was supposed to help American communities get clean water, safe roads, and basic infrastructure they desperately needed. The oversight committees weren't just pulling funding from Apex, they were restructuring how federal infrastructure contracts worked, requiring direct accountability with transparent progress tracking. And they wanted me to design and oversee this new verification system. Not as a federal employee, Ben clarified, as an independent contractor with full oversight authority. You'd essentially become the accountability watchdog for infrastructure projects across 3 states. "Why me?" I asked. "I worked for the company under investigation. Because you built verification methods into systems you knew most people wouldn't bother to check," George said. "That shows both integrity and forward thinking. And because those site supervisors we spoke with yesterday, they all vouched for your work. They said you were the only corporate guy who actually cared about getting things built right." Claire leaned forward. "Plus, you have military experience in exactly the type of projects we oversee. You understand both the technical requirements and the accountability standards. For the first time since that hospital night, I felt something other than shock or anger. I felt purpose. The same feeling I'd had in the army when we finished a bridge that would help Afghan villagers get their kids to school safely. "What about Apex?" I asked. "They're not going to just accept this quietly." "Mr. Garrison," George said seriously, "based on what we've uncovered in the last 48 hours, Apex infrastructure has much bigger problems than losing contracts. Federal fraud investigations tend to take on a life of their own." What I didn't know then was that Patty had already launched a desperate counteroffensive, one that would drag me into a battle more personal and vicious than I could have imagined. But that confrontation was still coming. First, I had sites to inspect and trust to rebuild, and an 8-year-old boy at home who needed to see that sometimes doing the right thing actually matters. The next morning, I called my friend Diana Kim, a federal contracts attorney who'd been urging me to sue Apex for wrongful termination ever since she heard about the hospital firing. "Forget the lawsuit," I told her over coffee at her downtown office. "Forget it?" she asked, nearly spilling her coffee. "Chuck, you're a single dad with medical bills. They fired you during a family emergency. That's textbook wrongful termination." "I have something better than a settlement," I said. "Better than potentially 6 figures in damages? I'm partnering with federal oversight committees. We're building a direct accountability system that bypasses corrupt contractors entirely." Diana set down her coffee cup and stared at me. "Patty Holbrook won't take that lying down. She's already been calling around, telling people you failed to show for a critical federal presentation. She's trying to destroy your professional reputation. Let her try," I said with more confidence than I felt. "The truth has a way of standing on its own." "Chuck, listen to me," Diana said seriously. "I've dealt with corporate executives backed into corners before. They don't go down quietly. Be careful." I spent the next week meeting with site supervisors across 3 counties, apologizing for promises broken and explaining our new approach. Most were skeptical at first. They'd heard grand federal plans before that turned into nothing but paperwork and empty guarantees. But when George authorized initial assessment funds directly to qualified local contractors without corporate middlemen taking their cut, attitudes shifted quickly. "This isn't charity," I explained to Andre Johnson, who supervised road crews in Pine Valley. "It's partnership. You know what your community needs better than any consultant in a suit. And what happens when these federal folks get bored and move on to the next political priority?" he challenged, arms crossed. "That's why we're building sustainable systems with real accountability," I replied. "But actual progress that people can see and use, not fabricated reports that look good in Washington meetings." Andre studied me for a moment, then smiled. The first genuine smile I'd seen from him. "Then let's get to work." While Austin recovered at home, I brought my laptop to the kitchen table instead of commuting to an office. He did homework beside me as I designed transparent tracking systems for each project site, creating online dashboards where anyone could see real progress photos, completion percentages, and budget allocations. "What are those red dots on your map?" he asked, pointing to my screen during a break from his math homework. "Those show where we need to fix things to help families have clean water and safe roads." He considered this seriously, the way 8-year-olds do when they're trying to understand the adult world. But they need those things every day. "Exactly," I said. "That's what we're working on. Will you have to travel to all those places?" "Some of them. But I'll always be home for dinner and I'll never miss another doctor's appointment." He nodded, satisfied, and went back to his math problems. By the second week, Patty's counteroffensive began in earnest. Former colleagues started calling with warnings that she was spreading rumors, claiming I'd stolen proprietary information, sabotaged federal presentations, even fabricated the verification protocols to undermine the company after being passed over for promotion. Then came the cease and desist letter, delivered by courier to my house while Austin and I were having breakfast. It claimed my oversight work violated non-compete clauses and confidentiality agreements, demanding I cease all cooperation with federal investigators. Austin looked up from his cereal. "What's that scary-looking letter, Dad?" "Just some people who are angry that we're trying to fix things the right way," I told him. "Are we in trouble?" "No, buddy. Sometimes when people do wrong things, they try to make the people telling the truth look bad. But we're going to keep doing what's right." He nodded and went back to his Cheerios, trusting completely that his dad would handle whatever needed handling. "They're desperate," George reassured me when I called about the legal threats. "Our attorneys reviewed your situation. This has no merit whatsoever. You can't violate a non-compete by cooperating with a federal investigation into your former employer's potential crimes. My stomach tightened. What happens now? That depends partly on you, George said, leaning back in his chair. We need someone who understands the technical systems and can help us verify what actually happened versus what was reported. As they explained their proposal, I realized this moment wasn't just about exposing fraud. It was about creating real infrastructure improvements for communities that had been promised help but received only fabricated progress reports and empty lots. The oversight committees weren't just pulling funding from Apex, they were restructuring the entire accountability system, requiring direct federal management with transparent progress tracking. And they wanted me to design and oversee this new verification framework. Not as an employee, Ben clarified quickly. As an independent contractor with full oversight authority. You'd essentially become the federal government's watchdog for infrastructure development in this region. Why me? I asked. I worked for the company that defrauded you because you built verification methods into systems you knew most people wouldn't bother to check, George said. That shows integrity under pressure. And because those site supervisors we spoke with, they all vouched for your technical competence and personal character. Claire added, your military background gives you credibility with both contractors and oversight committees. We need someone who understands both engineering and accountability. For the first time since that hospital night, I felt something other than shock or anger. I felt purpose. The same sense of mission I'd felt in the Army when we were building something that actually mattered. There's one more thing, Ben said, his expression growing serious. This investigation is going to get ugly. Companies don't like losing federal contracts, and people don't like going to prison. If you help us, you'll become a target. I thought about Austin at home with Mrs. Rodriguez, probably working on his math homework and asking her for help with words he couldn't pronounce. What kind of target? Legal harassment, character assassination, professional blacklisting, Claire explained. Standard corporate defense tactics when someone's threatening their revenue stream. What I didn't know then was that Patty had already launched her counteroffensive. One that would make the next few weeks more personal and vicious than I could have imagined. But that confrontation was still coming. First, I had communities to visit and trust to rebuild, and an 8-year-old boy at home who needed to see that sometimes doing the right thing actually matters, even when it's hard. The next morning, I called my friend Diana Kim, a federal contracts attorney who'd been urging me to sue Apex for wrongful termination ever since she heard about the email. Forget the lawsuit, I told her. I have something better. Better than a settlement? She asked, surprised. Chuck, you're a single dad with medical bills and no income. Be practical. I'm partnering with federal oversight. We're building a direct accountability model that bypasses corrupt contractors entirely. Her pause spoke volumes. Patty won't take that lying down. She's already telling people you failed to show for a critical presentation, that you abandoned your responsibilities. Let her, I said with more confidence than I felt. The truth has a way of standing up for itself. I spent the next week meeting with site supervisors and community leaders, apologizing for promises broken and explaining our new approach. Most were skeptical at first. They'd heard grand plans before from guys in suits who showed up, made presentations, and disappeared. But when George authorized initial verification funds directly to qualified local contractors without corporate middlemen taking their cut, attitudes shifted quickly. This isn't charity, I explained to Andre Johnson, who supervised road crews in Pine Valley. It's partnership. You know what your community needs better than any analyst sitting in an office. And what happens when these federal people get bored and move on to the next project? He challenged, gesturing toward the empty lot where a community center was supposed to have been built 2 years ago. That's why we're building sustainable systems with real accountability, I replied. But actual progress this time, not fabricated reports. Andre smiled. The first genuine smile I'd seen from him. Then let's get to work. While Austin recovered at home, I brought my laptop to the kitchen table instead of leaving for an office every day. He did homework beside me as I designed transparent tracking systems for each project site. For the first time in years, I was home when he got off the school bus. What are those red dots? He asked one afternoon, pointing to my screen while working on his spelling words. Those show where we need to build things to help families have clean water, I explained. He considered this seriously, the way kids do when they're trying to understand adult problems. But they need water every day, right? Exactly, I said. That's why we have to do this right the first time. By the second week, Patty's counteroffensive began in earnest. Former colleagues started calling with warnings that she was spreading rumors throughout the industry. I was a disgruntled employee who'd stolen proprietary information, sabotaged critical presentations, even fabricated the verification protocols to undermine the company after being passed over for promotion. The story she was telling painted me as vengeful and unstable, a man who'd cracked under the pressure of single fatherhood and was now lashing out at his former employer. Then came the cease and desist letter, hand-delivered by a courier while Austin and I were eating dinner. The legal document claimed my oversight work violated non-compete clauses and confidentiality agreements I'd signed when joining Apex. They're desperate, George reassured me when I called him that evening. Our legal team reviewed your employment contract. This has no merit. But the campaign escalated quickly. Patty contacted every project supervisor I'd been working with, warning them that cooperating with me could jeopardize future federal contracts. She reached out to other oversight agencies, painting me as a loose cannon who couldn't be trusted with sensitive information. Tell me honestly, I said to Ben during our weekly progress meeting, is this hurting the work? It's not helping, he admitted, sorting through reports. Some contractors are getting nervous. They worry about getting caught in corporate crossfire. I went home that night feeling defeated for the first time since this whole thing started. But the campaign escalated beyond legal threats. Patty contacted every site supervisor we were working with, warning them that cooperating with me could jeopardize future federal contracts. She reached out to other oversight agencies, painting me as a vengeful former employee who couldn't be trusted. Tell me honestly, I said to Ben during our weekly progress meeting, is this hurting the communities we're trying to help? Some contractors are getting nervous, he admitted. They worry about getting caught in corporate crossfire. A few have asked if they should pull back until this settles. I went home that night feeling defeated for the first time since this whole thing started. Austin noticed immediately when I walked through the door. Why do you look sad, Dad? I considered giving him a simple answer, but Austin was smart enough to know when adults weren't being straight with him. Sometimes when people do wrong things, they work very hard to make others look bad so no one notices what they did wrong. He absorbed this with the clear-eyed logic of 8-year-olds, like when Jimmy broke the fish tank at school but told everyone Kevin did it, exactly like that. But Mrs. Peterson saw what really happened, he said confidently. I kissed his forehead. Sometimes grown-ups forget to look for the real story. That night, after Austin was asleep, I stared at my ceiling wondering if I'd made a terrible mistake. I could have taken a severance package, found another corporate job, maintained financial security for my son. Instead, I'd chosen principles over practicality, and now it might hurt the very communities I was trying to help. My phone buzzed with a text from Claire. Turn on Channel 7 News right now. I grabbed the remote and found the local evening news covering a breaking story about federal investigations into infrastructure contract fraud. The reporter didn't name Apex specifically, but I recognized Patty standing beside her car in the company parking lot, ignoring shouted questions from journalists. Federal authorities conducted raids on 3 construction companies today, seizing documents related to allegedly fraudulent progress reports on federally funded infrastructure projects. My phone immediately started ringing. The next morning, 5 more federal agencies called requesting meetings about contract irregularities. We've been hearing concerning allegations about certain firms' project reporting, said a man who introduced himself as Larry from the Army Corps Engineering Division. We're launching our own investigation, but a colleague suggested we speak with you directly. By week's end, 8 different oversight committees had suspended all contracts with Apex Infrastructure, but Patty still had one more card to play, and it was the most personal yet. On Monday morning, I received a text message that made my blood run cold. We should discuss Austin's future educational opportunities. Patty had never met my son, never asked about him during 7 years of working together. That she would invoke his name now felt like crossing every line of decency. I showed the message to Diana, who went pale. This is moving into harassment territory, she warned. Document everything. 2 days later, I discovered what Patty had really been planning. George called me in a panic. Have you seen the new proposal Apex just submitted to regional contractors? No, I replied. What proposal? They've launched something called Project Austin. It's a direct copy of our accountability framework, down to the transparency requirements and community partnership model. I felt sick to my stomach. They've stolen our entire system, George continued, but rebranded it as their original innovation. They're approaching the same communities, offering identical oversight structures, claiming they developed this approach over years of research. The most devastating part wasn't just the theft of ideas. It was the calculated use of my son's name. Patty knew exactly what she was doing, taunting me with the knowledge that she could not only steal my work but appropriate something deeply personal to hurt me. I called an emergency meeting with our federal partners. We can fight this legally, Ben suggested. That could take years, Claire countered. Communities need infrastructure improvements now. What if we go public? George asked. Tell the media the whole story. I shook my head. Then these communities become collateral damage in a corporate war. They deserve better than that. The room fell quiet until I spoke again. Let me see the complete Project Austin proposal. Claire slid her tablet across the table. As I scrolled through the document, something extraordinary caught my attention, something that made me sit up straighter and almost laugh out loud. Patty had indeed copied our framework perfectly, but in her desperation, she'd also copied my embedded verification protocols, the exact same system that had exposed her original fraud. Even more importantly, she'd committed to completion timelines that were completely impossible. Look at these promises, I said, pointing to the screen. 85% completion in 6 weeks, full project delivery by quarter end. These numbers aren't achievable even with unlimited funding and perfect weather. Not even close, Ben agreed, studying the timeline. Exactly, I replied. She's setting herself up for spectacular public failure. But she'll blame implementation problems, George argued. Find scapegoats, not if we help these communities succeed first, I said quietly. The others looked confused. I don't want to compete with Project Austin, I explained. I want to ensure the communities it targets receive real help from us, working quietly with local teams without corporate logos or press coverage. You want to do the work without taking credit, Claire said slowly. I want these neighborhoods to succeed regardless of who gets recognition, I corrected. When Patty fails to deliver her impossible promises, these communities won't be left abandoned because we'll already be there doing actual work. That's not revenge, Ben said thoughtfully. That's protecting people. Yes, I agreed. And it's teaching my son that sometimes the best victories happen when nobody's watching. As we developed our quiet approach, my phone rang with a school alert. Austin's class was being dismissed early due to a power outage. I gathered my files quickly. I need to get my son. Family first, George assured me. We've got this covered. Driving to Austin's school, I thought about Patty's text regarding his future. The threat still bothered me, but somehow the fear had transformed into determination. I wouldn't let her turn my son's name into a corporate branding exercise destined to fail. Instead, I'd ensure that anything connected to his name actually helped people in lasting, meaningful ways. When I arrived at school, Austin ran to me with a drawing clutched in his small hands. Look what I made in art class. The picture showed 2 stick figures, one tall, one small, standing beside what looked like a road with happy families walking on it. It's us helping people get to work and school safely, he explained proudly. I hugged him tightly, finally understanding what real success looked like. Not corporate recognition or professional advancement, but showing my son through actions that making things better for others was always worth fighting for. Thank you for staying with me through this entire journey. If anything in my story resonated with you, please hit that like button. It helps other people find these real experiences. Subscribe if you haven't already, because there are more stories about standing up for what matters. Your support means everything. Remember, sometimes the most important battles are fought quietly, and the greatest victories happen when we choose integrity over convenience, every single time.